happy to be here. I will talk about museums, communities and practices. But I won't really talk about museums. I will talk about my museum, the Jewish Museum in Berlin. So I am a bit case study-ish. I hope I'm not too descriptive, which is always the problem if you are addressing a keynote and you are too descriptive. But it's some ideas that I'm dealing with now, being from theory back in practice, which is not always easy. I will talk about ICH. I have a very broad definition of what ICH is. Maybe we can talk about that during the coffee break, whether or not you agree with my sort of opening up the definitions. And I think ICH, in my case study or in my museum, it is a glue, but it also causes a lot of ammunition between the different stakeholders that we have as a museum. And of course, a large, I would say, intangible aspect is the Jewishness or the Jewish imposed Shoah Germany, which is of course very specific, but I hope that on a sort of abstract level for you being in practice, it can also be part of your, or it probably is also part of your everyday thinking. And what kind of toolbox do we need as professionals dealing with ICH and museums and communities? I'm a huge fan of the idea of the liquid museum that Fiona Cameron stole from Bauman. And we as a Jewish museum, we try to be a sort of liquid museum, and we are now having a new vision. And our vision is productive unease. So productieve onroer in the museum context and also in society. And I hope that this productive unease is sort of reflecting on that Bauman kind of liquidity. You probably, or a lot of you have probably visited the museum, 700,000 visitors a day, or a year. 80% of them are tourists, but 5% of the people working in the museum have a Jewish background. 95% of the museum visiting don't have any Jewish background at all. So we are not a community museum, although we are often perceived as one. It's a sort of dilemma that I and my colleagues have to deal with. You have to see this museum project as part of the German reunification and Berlin becoming the new capital after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So it's a very strong political project with all the difficulties attached to it. But being this non-community museum dealing with the Jewish, it's difficult to implement new museological discourses that I'm very into. And it's also difficult to talk about participation, because who is participating with whom? And what does representation mean in a context of 5% people working in the museum having a Jewish background, 95% of the museum visitors are not Jewish but have a strong interest. And what does a source community mean in a sort of post Shoah context in Europe, and I will come back to that later. I hope by now you see that sort of sometimes it creates a bit of headache. Talking about ICH, I think it's important for me to stress here that Jewish cultural heritage in Europe post-45 is in itself very intangible, because so much has been lost and not only the material objects, but also, of course, a lot of the community is not there anymore. So you could say that, in fact, there is a very intangible aspect in it. And in relation to ICH, you can say, who are the people, and what does practice mean when there are hardly any Jews left anymore? It's something that we are reflecting about a lot. And it's being, of course, very much reflected in art. If you are familiar with the works of Micha Ullmann, he's always sort of reflecting on the loss, the intangible aspect, because nothing is there anymore. Edmund de Waal, a very famous artist, reflecting on the same matter, or Botansky reflect on this lostness. And also the Liebeskind architecture itself. This is one of the so-called 5 voids, these 5 empty spaces, these voids in the museum that reflect this lostness, this non-material aspect of Jewish culture that is not there anymore. And we are now having an artist, Misha Kubal, who is reflecting on this lostness and the architecture of Liebeskind. And coming Thursday and Friday, we'll be having a void projected in the Berlin space to sort of reflect on that which is not there anymore. And talking about ICH and Jewish material culture, or Jewish non-material culture, it's important to stress that, I think. But there's also another ICH element that I would like to reflect upon. It's the intangible in the tangible, that because there's so much that is lost, the stories behind the objects are mostly more important than the objects themselves. A, because there are not so many objects left anymore, and B, because the stories related to those objects are highly emotional. And this is one example of a lot of objects you find in our archives, in our collections, and also in our exhibition spaces. This is a towel of Paul Kuttner, and he got this towel from his mother when he, after the pogrom, night 38, he was one of the children's transport children who could go to England. And he says that he has never unfolded this towel, and it's still the same towel with the same folds in it as his mother gave it to him when he left on the train. Whether or not that is true, that's of course not relevant. It's about the story and the emotions attached to this object. And Paul Kuttner, as many people, are this German Jewish source community which is spread around the world that we are trying to get into contact with. It's I would say the source community, as we also call it in an ethnographical context. And we get a lot of donations. And actually the context of a Jewish museum is different than the context of an ethnographical museum, because in the ethnographical it's a lot of times about repatriation of objects, and in the Jewish museum context it's a lot of times donating these objects to the museum. So this towel is going back to Germany where it once was, which is of course very, very layered. So this object needed to be in Berlin. Which is of course highly layered with expectations that we as museum can't cope with. And it's this very emotional relationship that we have with survivors and our source community. And we are now trying to get into more contact with the second and third generation, because as you know, demographically, the survivors are almost all gone by now. So what we're trying to do is establish a heritage community, not only with the people that are still there, but specifically with the second and third generation, so that there's a sense of ownership of this idea of the Jewish Museum and where it stands for, whether you are in Berlin, at the south of Amsterdam, or Washington Heights or Tel Aviv, for that matter. So this sense of ownership and all which is attached to it is, I think, also part of this emotional ICH, which is related to what we're doing. Coming back to the urban, I find it a bit difficult to talk about Jewish ICH and the urban, because it sort of reflects on a lot of stereotypes on Jewish culture and the cosmopolitan, but I would like to reflect on something else, namely Kreuzberg. Kreuzberg, where the museum is located, I would say it's one of the most super diverse neighborhoods in Berlin and maybe even Europe-wide. It has a very strong Muslim community. You could say that 80% of the people living in the borough of Kreuzberg have a Muslim background. So we do a lot of outreach already for quite some time. But it's also a matter of how do we relate as a museum to a changing society. That's why the museum opened 2013 at the other side of the road of the museum academy, the Blumenthal Academy. Blumenthal is the founding director of the museum, which hosts the academic programs, and they consist out of two pillars. One pillar relates to migration and diversity. So what does it mean for a Jewish community and a Muslim community to be in a dominant Christian society, and a specific Jewish Islam forum, which is even more related to the building strategic alliances as a Jewish Islam communities. So it's very much about dialogue, and it's very much about looking for commonalities, looking for practices that are shared by those two groups in contemporary German society. And one example, for example, is modest fashion. Modest fashion is a thing for a lot of young Muslimas to dress modestly as a young religious Muslim woman. And how does this practice connect with, for example, Orthodox women living in New York or also Antwerp? So we try to get into a dialogue with on those topics. Another topic is, for example, fertility practices and the ethics in relation to fertility practices within the Jewish and Islam religious context. And the group that is visiting these academic programs is a group of people that everybody is dying for in the museum context. They're young and they're super diverse. So that's something that we have achieved by opening up and going beyond the traditional Jewish context. And what I think we created is a more fluent concept of what a community can be if you start to negotiate and talk about practices which of course are very intangible within those two cultural contexts. But it is very highly academic. You could say it's very highbrow, so what can you do which is less academic and maybe more inclusive? What we are now establishing is a children's museum, and I invite you all to come when it's opened at the end of 2019. A children's museum, age groups 3 to 10-year-olds. It's a very known story. Everybody here knows the story. It's the Noah's Ark. So it's a biblical story that we took and as a point of departure. It's a round shape, as you can see, because the round shape goes back to even an earlier flood story, namely the Mesopotamic one. But we focus on the 3 monotheistic religions. And why do we do that? Because we feel that for 17 years ago we landed as a sort of spaceship in this hyper-diverse borough of Kreuzberg, and how can you be more inclusive and be a place of meaning and relevancy in the direct vicinity of our museum. And it's not about Israel, and it's not about the Holocaust, but it's a very biblical story relating to diversity, embracing diversity, of course the issue of sustainability, and very much this vision of making a better world, which you could say is even very Jewish, this whole idea of tikkun olam, that every Jew has the obligation to repair the world. So we're trying to empower children to repair the world because our world needs a lot of repair. Another example of ICH, which is sort of our everyday context, because we are the most secured museum in Germany. Everybody needs to go to a security context which is even worse than going to an airport. And that's part of what we have to deal with on an everyday basis. And it's part of our everyday practice. It says something, of course, about a Jewish context within a German setting. So we try to embrace that in a sort of cultural practice that reflects this process in a more humoristic, playful way. But it's a difficult question. You know, we as museums, we want to be inclusive, we want to be barrier-free, we want to be this third space, this public space where negotiation happens. But how is that possible when you have to sort of go through Fort Knox before you enter my space? How can I be this place of dialogue, this forum, this agora? If you have an answer, please tell me in the coffee break, because it is really difficult. But what we are doing is reflecting on the flood, the water, the negative and the positive sides of water, the life-spending quality of it. But we even go one step beyond the obvious monotheistic context. We are trying to look at flood stories, because flood stories are everywhere. In every age, in every culture, in indigenous cultures, there is the story of the flood. In the north, the Inuit, it's the snow rather than rain, but again, it's connected to the environment. So we're now trying to establish contacts with other communities in Berlin. Berlin is, of course, this very super diverse context. So these other flood stories of other communities will also be depicted in the museum. And then your point of departure is this political establishment, and then you end up with a children's museum that embraces the whole world, and where we're talking about canonic stories, namely flood or respect or dealing with difficulties. Going beyond the Jewish, I think that's very important in our fluent societies. I think it contributes to the relevancy of this museum. It's something that I very strongly embrace as a program director. But it's not difficult, because it's of course a highly political context that I'm working in. And we are now showing an exhibition in the museum, Welcome to Jerusalem, where it's about the holy city of Jerusalem and not only the Jewish context of Jerusalem, but again the monotheistic context of Jerusalem. And it's sort of a touristic first glance into the museum. So at our first flyer, we took the Dome of the Rock, Half-Moon Crescent, because it's such a lieu de mémoire in Jerusalem, because you see the Dome of the Rock everywhere. I don't know if if you've been to Jerusalem, but it's everywhere in the visual landscape of the city. We were being attacked by the Jewish community, by the Israeli government, by the Israeli embassy, and then you have this difficulty: whom do you represent? Whose community? Whose representation? Whose political story? And then I can say, okay, we are funded by the German state. We are an independent context. But it is not so easy. And then I can try to talk about contact zones, that we should get into a dialogue with each other, etc., etc. But it is not easy. So when we try to invite, or we wanted to invite, a queer Palestinian talking about queerness in East Jerusalem, we were more or less forced to disinvite him. And then on the other hand, on the one hand, I was being heavily attacked by one part of the community saying, you bow your head to certain elements within the community. And for the other group, we were not Jewish enough. So it's this process of negotiation between all those stakeholders. And especially if it comes then to ICH, it becomes more and more political. One thing that interests me very much, and I'm coming more or less to an end, a few slides, is the contemporary Jewish community which is now living in Berlin. And I don't know how many of you are aware of the demographics, but after the fall of the wall, a lot of Jews from the post-Soviet times came from post-Soviet countries. So now the Jewish community in Germany consists out of 90% of people that have a Russian or Soviet background. So you could say, what is their relationship with German Jewish history? And how do you bring the gap between this former community and their stories, which are hardly there anymore, and the actual community which is now living in Germany. And not only German or Russian-speaking or formerly Russian-speaking Jews are living in Germany, but also a lot of Israelis and others as well. So how do you bring, how do you connect to this community, especially when a lot of them are non-religious and they have long, sort of distant feeling towards these religious practices. And what we have noticed, and it's also confirming in theory, is that museums are sort of this, Jewish museums can play a very good role in being a non-religious, secular meaning maker that reflects on Jewish culture and religion and practices, but it's not institutionalized in the Jewish community. And here one of my colleagues asked a group of people, this is one slide, in the realm of her PhD, to draw a mind map of Jewish places in Berlin. And in a lot of those sketches, the Jewish Museum turned up. So you see that this Jewish Museum plays a role for a contemporary Jewish community, although they are very distant to religious contexts in Berlin and in Germany in general. But what does that mean for us? For us as being heritage professionals, because we are the ones, to quote Aleida Aspang, who make heritage, who make meaning. So we are the ones making the Jewishness for this Jewish community that is interested to get to know more about their practices, which is highly strange when 95% of the people working in the museum are non-Jewish themselves. So you have a very variety of possibilities, how you can be a meaningful space, which is not related to folklore, which is not, which deals with authenticity in a sort of fluid, modern way. And I have two examples of that for you. One is this shofar musician, and a shofar is the horn of an uncastrated male sheep, and you blow the horn during Jewish New Year, but also on Atonement Day, Yom Kippur. So it's very important during the high holidays. And when is something authentic, and when do you sort of pretend to play a practice which is not related to the museum setting, because this, of course, needs to be practiced in a synagogue, which we are not. So what we did, and I think that's the way of us dealing with ICH in this museum context, which is highly political and with all those different stakeholders informed, is that we didn't ask a rabbi to do it, but we asked an Israeli musician who is also half of the time living in Berlin, and he's one of the only persons who can play the shofar in a professional sort of way. He also does it in different settings outside of the synagogue. And that was for us very important in relation to authenticity. And another thing that I'm very interested in, and I already did some of those practices in my former life in Jewish museums, but now also in the Jewish Museum in Berlin, is how can you be a space of meaning where things happen, where you can have a community sort of dialogue and have a practice without becoming a community museum, which I also, per definition, never can be, is a practice that we had 2 weeks ago, namely the Jewish ritual wedding of Daniel Kahn. Maybe one of you has heard about him. He's a very famous klezmer musician. And he met, and that's not unimportant for the story, he met his beautiful wife in the museum, because he often performs in the museum with his klezmer band. And for them it was very important to have this wedding in the museum because it was the first time where they met, and they also are not religious but secular Jews, but still having a tie with Jewish practices. So they asked us whether or not we wanted to host their wedding, which in a traditional sense is always an open event. So people in the small shtetls, or also in towns, came to the wedding, and it was sort of an open public event. Here the public event in the Jewish Museum is of course something else, because regular visitors visited the museum and were experiencing a wedding. So there were all these layers that we as ethnographers also described, and we will also, when we are collecting this or documenting this for our collections or the photographs, and of course the broken glass, will be part of the narrative, because you need to know the narrative to sort of to form it, to get a grip on the story. The beautiful thing is that we are opening in the museum in November an exhibition on contemporary Jewish life, and then the photos and the broken glass will of course also be depicted. So there's a layer in that too. The question whether or not we could host this wedding in the museum, and whether or not it was a sort of performance or it was a practice which is related to some kind of authenticity was very much debated. And if another person would stand here, you would get another story. But I think in the context of ICH, and especially in this highly layered museum context that I'm now working in, it's all about the context that matters. And the context that you then also document when you document the story. To make a long story short, it's not so easy. And it's especially not easy when you are performing or trying to think about ICH in a state-funded, highly political museum as I am now working in. The same goes for other museums as well. I'm now working in the Jewish Museum, so I picked the Jewish Museum example. But not trying is, I think, not a good solution. We have to try, and we always have to sort of look where the boundaries are, where conflicts arise, and then it gets interesting. Then you become this contact zone, which I think we all want to become as a museum, this place of dialogue, this place of context, this heterotopian space that Foucault talked about. But it doesn't mean you don't create enemies, but maybe that's my task as the program director of the Jewish Museum, that whatever you do, somebody will be angry anyway.